The stagecoach arrived at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon, which was, by most accounts, the most ordinary hour of an otherwise forgettable day in Redstone Hollow, Texas. It did not stay ordinary for long. The town sat baked and bleached beneath a merciless August sun, a collection of weathered storefronts, dusty boardwalks, and sun-cracked earth that stretched in every direction like the land itself had given up trying to be beautiful. Cowboys lounged outside the saloon with their boots propped up and their hats pulled low. The blacksmith hammered in slow, rhythmic strokes. Two old men played cards on an upturned barrel outside the general store, neither of them winning, neither of them particularly bothered about it. Then the stagecoach rounded the corner at the top of Main Street, and the horses slowed, and the door swung open, and Redstone Hollow stopped breathing. She stepped down onto the dusty street like she had rehearsed it 1,000 times and had never once been nervous about the performance. One hand held a dark leather satchel. The other smoothed the front of her deep green traveling dress, elegant, composed. Not a single unnecessary wrinkle despite what must have been hours of hard road. She stood tall. She looked around slowly, the way a person looks at something they have already decided to love. Her name was Sarah Caldwell. She was 29 years old. And she was, without question or argument, the most striking woman anyone in Redstone Hollow had ever seen ride in on a Thursday afternoon, or any other afternoon, for that matter. The cowboys outside the saloon forgot what they were talking about. The blacksmith's hammer came to a slow, unconscious stop. The two old men at the barrel both looked up from their cards at precisely the same moment, which was the first thing they had agreed on in 11 years. Sarah did not seem to notice any of it, or perhaps she simply did not let it change anything about the way she carried herself, chin level, shoulders square, dark eyes calm and quietly alert. On her left hand, catching a slant of afternoon sun, was a gold wedding ring. The first person to move was Mrs. Hattie Cole. Hattie ran the boarding house at the south end of Main Street, a two-story whitewashed building that was slightly less dusty than everything around it, which was the closest thing Redstone Hollow had to elegance. She was a round, warm woman of 53 with silver-streaked hair and the particular sharpness of someone who had lived enough life to recognize quality when it stepped off a stagecoach. She came down her front steps wiping her hands on her apron and extended one to Sarah with a smile that asked no questions and made no demands. "Hattie Cole," she said simply, "you look like you could use a cool room and a hot meal." Sarah took her hand and returned the smile, and there was something in it, something behind the composure, a flicker of relief so brief most people would have missed it entirely. "Sarah Caldwell," she said, "and you have no idea how right you are." By evening, the news had traveled the full length of Redstone Hollow and back again, the way news always does in small towns, carried on whispers from the saloon to the general store to the barber shop, to every dinner table in between, growing slightly larger with each retelling. Sarah Caldwell was the widow of Colonel Elias Caldwell, who had passed 4 months prior after a brief illness. The colonel had been a man of considerable means and quiet reputation, a former military officer who had purchased 600 acres of prime Texas land some years back with the intention of building something lasting. He had named it Sunridge Ranch. He had not lived long enough to see it become what he imagined, but he had, in his final weeks, put every legal acre of it into his wife's name. Every legal acre, including the freshwater creek that ran straight through the heart of the property. That detail, when it reached the right ears, produced a silence of a very different kind than the one Sarah's arrival had caused. This silence was cold and calculating. It belonged to 3 men seated at the largest table in the saloon, and none of them were smiling. Duke Harlan was the wealthiest cattle baron in the county, a broad, heavy man in an expensive hat who had grown so accustomed to getting what he wanted that the muscles required for patience had long since stopped working. Across from him sat Walt Briggs, lean and sharp-eyed, who processed information the way a snake watches a field mouse, very still, very focused, thinking 3 moves ahead. Beside Walt was his younger brother Roy, who processed information considerably more slowly and made up for it by being loudly certain about whatever conclusion he eventually reached. 600 acres, Walt said quietly. And the creek, Duke added. Roy said something ungenerous about widows who didn't know their place, and neither of the other two bothered to respond, because they were already thinking about deeds and lawyers and water rights, and how quickly a woman alone, new to town and new to frontier life, could be made to feel that selling was the only sensible option. Sarah did not know precisely what was being said about her that evening, but she had a reasonable idea. She sat at the small desk in her room at Hattie's boarding house, the window open to the cooling night air, a map of Sunridge Ranch spread across the surface in front of her. She had studied that map so many times since Elia's past that she could have drawn it from memory, every ridge, every fence line, every bend in the creek. She heard the door at the bottom of the stairs open and close, and then a knock at her door. Hattie entered with a cup of coffee and the careful expression of a woman choosing her words. "You should know," Hattie said gently, setting the cup down, "that this town has a way of making things difficult for people it hasn't decided to accept yet." Sarah looked up from the map. She was quiet for a moment, then something settled in her expression, not hardness exactly, something more like certainty. "Then it's a good thing," Sarah said, "that I'm not leaving." Hattie looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once slowly, and the corner of her mouth curved into something that looked very much like hope. Outside, the Texas night stretched wide and star-filled over the dust and rooftops of Redstone Hollow. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, 600 acres of land waited in the dark, neglected, forgotten, full of quiet potential. Sarah Caldwell touched the gold ring on her finger, looked back at her map, and began to plan. Sunridge Ranch looked like a place that had forgotten it was ever alive. Sarah rode out to it the following morning on a borrowed mare, with Hattie's directions in her pocket and the early sun at her back. She came over a low ridge and pulled the horse to a stop, and for a long moment she simply looked at what Elias had left her. The farmhouse stood at the center of the property, a solid structure with good bones. She could see that much, but the porch sagged on one side and two of the front shutters hung at defeated angles. The barn beyond it needed new planking on the eastern wall. The fencing that divided the grazing land stretched unevenly in places and had collapsed entirely in others, the posts leaning like tired old men who had stopped pretending they could stand straight. The creek, at least, was everything the map had promised, clear and steady, threading through the southern edge of the property with the quiet authority of something that knew its own worth. Sarah exhaled slowly. Then she dismounted, tied the mare to the fence post that was still standing, and walked toward the farmhouse. She did not see devastation. She saw a list of things to do, and she had always been good at lists. Within 4 days, she had hired 3 men. The first was Miguel Reyes, 31 years old, with calloused hands and a decade of ranching experience that should have made him one of the most sought-after ranch hands in the county. Instead, he had spent the last 8 months unable to find steady work, because Duke Harlan had quietly made it known that anyone who employed Miguel was making an enemy of Harlan's operation. The reason Harlan had blacklisted him was simple and petty. Miguel had once refused to look the other way when Harlan's men moved a fence line onto a neighbor's property. He had said so, clearly and without apology, and that had been enough. Sarah found him outside the feed store and she offered him fair wages and said nothing about Harlan at all. Miguel looked at her for a measured moment. "You know who I am?" he asked. "I know what you can do," she said. "That's what I'm paying for." He started the next morning. The second was a young woman named Clara Webb, 19, quick-minded and entirely wasted on the laundry work she had been doing since her family's farm failed 2 years prior. Clara could ride, she could keep accounts, and she had a memory for detail that most men with formal education would have envied. Nobody had thought to ask her to use any of it. Sarah asked within the first 10 minutes of meeting her. The third was old Pete Dawson, who was 64 and walked with a permanent lean to the left from an old injury, but who knew cattle behavior better than anyone in 3 counties and could read weather in the color of a morning sky. He came cheaply and gratefully and worked without complaint, and by the end of the first week, Sunridge Ranch had something it had not possessed in years. It had people in it who believed in it. Duke Harlan arrived on a Wednesday. He rode up the newly cleared path to the farmhouse with 2 of his men flanking him, and the particular ease of someone who has never in his adult life approached a door he expected to be closed. He wore his expensive hat and his most reasonable expression, which was the most dangerous version of him. Sarah met him on the porch. He smiled and said all the polite things first: condolences for her loss, admiration for her courage in making such a journey, comments about what a difficult undertaking it must be for a woman managing alone. He said them warmly and without a single honest word in any of them. Then he made his offer, a sum that sounded large until you understood what 600 acres with a private freshwater creek was actually worth, at which point it revealed itself as an insult dressed in a good coat. Sarah listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she smiled pleasantly. "Thank you, Mr. Harlan," she said. "I'll keep that in mind if I ever decide to leave, which I won't." She tilted her head slightly. "Will there be anything else?" The reasonable expression flickered, just briefly. Then he replaced it, tipped his hat, and rode back down the path with his men, and Sarah watched him go and did not move from the porch until the dust had settled completely. Walt Briggs chose a different weapon. He filed a water rights dispute with the county office, claiming documentation that suggested the creek predated Sarah's deed and had historically served Briggs' land. It was carefully constructed nonsense, but it was the kind of nonsense that could take months to untangle, which was, of course, entirely the point. A woman bogged down in legal proceedings was a woman too distracted to build anything. Sarah rode to the county seat alone on a Friday morning. She brought the original deed, Elia's surveying records from the year he purchased the land, and 3 years of handwritten correspondence between Elia's and the county land office that established the creek's boundaries with absolute clarity. She was home by Thursday evening. The water rights case was closed in her favor before the following week was out. The fences went down on a moonless night, 2 weeks after Harlan's visit. Sarah woke before dawn to Miguel's quiet knock at the farmhouse door. His expression said everything before his words did. She dressed, pulled on her boots, and walked outside into the gray pre-dawn air. The eastern fencing lay flat across the ground in long broken sections. The cattle had scattered across 2 neighboring fields in the dark. She stood and looked at it. The cold morning air moved around her. "How many hands do we have today?" she asked. "All of us," Miguel said. "Clara's already saddling up." Sarah nodded once. "Then let's get the cattle first." By noon they had rounded up every last head. By mid-afternoon the fence posts were back in the ground. By sunset, every section of fence was standing straighter and stronger than it had before the night Harlan's men had torn it down, because Sarah had purchased better timber at the lumber yard the previous week, and Miguel had known exactly how to set it properly. That evening, Sarah lit the fire in the farmhouse hearth, the first fire Sunridge had seen in years. The smoke rose warm and steady into the cooling Texas sky, visible from the edge of town, visible from the Harlan property, visible from anywhere that needed to see it. Redstone Hollow saw it. People stood on their porches and looked toward Sunridge and said nothing, but something shifted in the quiet, something that felt, cautiously and tentatively, like the beginning of respect. Sheriff James Calloway saw the smoke from the road where he had stopped his horse without quite meaning to. He watched it rise for a long moment, steady and unhurried against the darkening sky. Then something moved across his expression, something he didn't name and didn't try to. He turned his horse toward town and rode slowly, and he was thinking about Sarah Caldwell the whole way home. The forged deed appeared on a Monday morning, which was, Sarah would later think, exactly the kind of thing Duke Harlan would do on a Monday: start the week with a lie and call it business. The document was filed with the county circuit court and claimed that Colonel Elias Caldwell had sold Sunridge Ranch to Duke Harlan 11 months prior, 3 months before his death, in a private transaction witnessed by two men whose signatures Sarah did not recognize and whose existence she immediately doubted. The circuit judge assigned to hear the case was a narrow-faced man named Judge Clarence Prout, who arrived in Redstone Hollow 2 days later in Harlan's personal coach, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about how that particular arrangement worked. The hearing was set for Friday. By Tuesday evening, word had moved through every corner of Redstone Hollow. People spoke about it in lowered voices in the general store, over dinner tables, in the quiet between the blacksmith's hammer strikes. Most of them had watched Sarah Caldwell for weeks now. They had watched her ride out at dawn and return at dusk. They had watched her win the water rights case and repair the fences and keep working with the steady, unhurried purpose of someone who was not performing strength but actually possessed it. And now they watched and waited to see if all of it would simply be taken from her by a piece of paper and a bought judge. Sarah, meanwhile, was not waiting. She had been building her case quietly since the week after Harlan's visit, with the same methodical care she had applied to everything else at Sunridge. She had the original deed, registered and stamped by the county land office on the date of purchase. She had Elias' will, written in his own careful hand, and notarized by a lawyer in San Antonio who was very much alive and very much willing to testify to its legitimacy. She had 3 letters Elias had written to her in the final months of his life, each one referencing Sunridge by name and by her name as its rightful heir. And she had something else, something Walt Briggs had not considered when he helped Harlan construct the forgery. The date on the forged deed was a Thursday in October. Sarah had a letter from Elias, written that same Thursday, describing in warm and specific detail the view from their parlor window, and asking her to bring her blue shawl when she came to visit him the following month. A man does not write tender letters about parlor windows and blue shawls on the same afternoon. He is secretly selling his land. She had also, carefully and without drawing attention to it, spoken to 4 people in town who confirmed that Judge Prout had dined privately at Harlan's property on the night of his arrival. She wrote all of it down in her clean, precise handwriting and organized it into a leather folder that she set on the farmhouse table Thursday night and did not touch again until morning. Friday came bright and cloudless. Sarah rode into town alone, dressed simply, the leather folder across her saddle. She tied her horse outside the courthouse and walked up the steps and stopped. The street behind her was filling with people. Mrs. Hattie Cole stood on the boardwalk across the road in her good dress, her hands folded in front of her, her chin up. Beside her was Miguel, and beside him was Clara, and beside Clara was old Pete Dawson with his permanent leftward lean and his hat held over his chest. Behind them stood the workers Sarah had hired, and behind them stood people Sarah recognized only from passing, shopkeepers, families, men and women who had watched from a careful distance, and had apparently decided that this particular morning was worth showing up for. Sheriff James Calloway stood at the base of the courthouse steps. He had not planned a speech. He simply looked at Judge Prout, who was already seated inside and visible through the open door, and said clearly enough for the gathered crowd to hear, "This proceeding will be conducted properly, Your Honor, with full public witness. The town of Redstone Hollow will be watching." It was not a threat, it was a fact, and it landed with the quiet, immovable weight of one. Inside, Duke Harlan sat with his lawyer and his forged deed, and the absolute confidence of a man who had never lost anything he had decided to take. He did not look at Sarah when she entered. That was a mistake, not because she needed him to, but because it meant he was not paying attention to what she was carrying. Sarah laid her evidence on the table with the unhurried composure of someone who had organized it 100 times in her mind and knew exactly where everything was. She walked Judge Prout through each document without raising her voice once. The original deed, the will, the letters, the Thursday letter which she saved for last, setting it down and allowing the silence that followed it to do its own considerable work. The forged deed had Elias Caldwell selling his land on the same afternoon. He was writing lovingly to his wife about the color of a shawl. Harlan's lawyer said something about coincidence. Nobody in the room appeared to find it convincing, including, visibly, Judge Prout, who had arrived bought and was now performing a rapid private calculation about what his own name would be worth when this proceeding became public record, which it clearly and unavoidably would. He ruled in Sarah's favor before noon. The reaction in the courtroom was not loud. It was the particular quiet of people exhaling something they had been holding for a long time. Outside on the steps, the gathered crowd received the news and responded with the kind of sound a town makes when it recognizes that something has been set right, not celebration exactly, but relief given voice. Hattie pressed both hands to her mouth. Clara laughed. Miguel looked at the ground and nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms what he already believed about a person. Duke Harlan walked out of the courthouse and into the full public view of everyone he had spent years intimidating, and for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, he had nothing to say. The fraud charges followed him home. Walt and Roy Briggs lost the water dispute permanently before the week was out. The structures they had built on other people's fear took very little time to fall once someone had been unafraid enough to push. Sarah stood on the courthouse steps in the afternoon sun. She was not performing triumph. She was simply standing, present, steady, exactly where she had decided to be from the first moment she stepped off a stagecoach into this dusty town and felt every eye in it try to decide what she was made of. Sheriff Calloway came up the steps and stopped beside her. He removed his hat. He looked out at the town for a moment, then at her, with the expression of a man who has been carefully not saying something for several weeks and has finally run out of reasons not to say it. "I imagine," he said quietly, "that Sunridge is going to be something worth seeing in another year or two." Sarah looked out past the rooftops, toward the ridge beyond which her land sat green and waiting in the afternoon light. She could almost see the smoke from the farmhouse chimney from here. Almost. "Come and see for yourself," she said, "any time you like." It was a simple thing to say. They both understood it was not a simple thing at all. He smiled, the kind of smile a serious man produces rarely and means completely, and put his hat back on. And they stood together on the courthouse steps while Redstone Hollow moved around them, warmer and lighter than it had been that morning. 3 weeks later, Sunridge Ranch was alive in every sense of the word. The farmhouse was repaired and painted. The fencing ran straight and true across 600 acres. The cattle were fat and settled. The creek ran clean through the southern pasture, unhurried and unchallenged, belonging to exactly the land it had always belonged to. In the evenings, there was laughter from the bunkhouse and the smell of supper from the kitchen and the sound of hammers building something new somewhere on the property, because there was always something being built. Sarah stood on the porch at golden hour, the long Texas light turning everything it touched to copper and warmth. Calloway sat on the porch steps beside her, his hat resting on his knee, saying nothing in the easy way of someone comfortable with silence. Hattie was inside. Miguel and Clara were somewhere near the barn, arguing cheerfully about fence post measurements. Old Pete was watching the sky and predicting rain by Sunday, which everyone doubted and which he was usually right about. Sarah looked down at the gold ring on her finger. She held it there for a quiet moment, honoring the man who had bought this land with a dream he never saw finished, who had trusted her with everything he had built and everything he had not yet built, and the difference between the two. Then she looked up at the wide, golden, unhurried world in front of her. The dream she had ridden into town with, wrapped around her finger like a question, it had answered itself. Not the way she had imagined when she first stepped off that stagecoach into the dust and the stairs and the silence. Better. In the way that real things are always better than imagined ones, because they have weight and warmth and the smell of wood smoke and the sound of people you love nearby. She had ridden into Redstone Hollow with nothing but a wedding ring and a dream in her heart. She was leaving neither behind. She was only adding to them. And every rancher in the county knew, quietly, and with the particular clarity of people who have witnessed something they cannot argue with, that things in this valley had changed. Sarah Caldwell had seen to that.